back, everybody. You're listening to This Week in America. Thank you so much for joining us. Our privilege to have Stephen Kinzer on the program, best-selling author, award-winning foreign correspondent, author of the bestseller All the Shah's Men, more recently Overthrow, which was a bestseller a year ago, now available in paperback. Stephen Kinzer, our guest. Stephen, welcome to This Week in America.
Wonderful to be with you.
It is a fascinating book, and for people who think, okay, this is sort of a deviation from foreign policy, what we've seen with the Bush administration, the regime change, actually, you make a very valid argument that regime change basically started as the United States policy at January 14th, 1893 in Hawaii.
That's the basic premise that I start from in my book, that if you think that George Bush violently pulled the United States away from its long tradition of cooperative diplomacy and pushed us into a new era in which we would violently intervene in the affairs of faraway countries, you're mistaken. Actually, the United States has been doing that for more than 100 years. And in the book, what I do is I look at the 14 times that the United States has overthrown a foreign government, and then for each of these 14 cases, I ask three questions. The first question is, what happened? How did we overthrow the government of this particular country? And I've tried to reconstruct these episodes in dramatic, almost hour-by-hour ways. The second question is, why? Why did we do it? And the third question is, from the perspective of today, from the perspective of history, what has been the long-term effect of these interventions? So by considering these overthrows of foreign governments not as a series of disconnected, unrelated episodes, but rather as part of a continuum that stretches over more than 100 years, we're able to see patterns that emerge. And you can't see those patterns unless you start studying these and learning about these operations all together.
It's interesting because if you take each of the operations in these 14 countries, and you mentioned this 14, these are where we really had a major role in changing the government. There are a lot of others where we were involved, but not to the extent we were in these 14. If you look at the operations and didn't know the country and the president, you could pretty well interchange that with current day in Iraq and George W. Bush, because there are a lot of similarities from back when we took over Hawaii to the current time in Iraq.
There are a number of similarities. Just to cite a couple of them that tend to come up time and time again. In almost all of these cases, one of the fundamental reasons that these clashes begin is that the target country is either a market or has a resource that the United States wants. There are very few cases where the U.S. Intervenes in a country where it doesn't have some kind of an economic interest. Another, perhaps more transcendent theme that ties these operations together is the law of unpredicted consequences. When you violently intervene in the affairs of another country, you cannot predict what the effects are going to be. And in many cases, we can now look back on our own interventions and see that although they seemed successful at the time, because we threw out a government we didn't like and we put someone in that we did like, in the long run, they wound up not only being devastating in many cases for the target countries, but actually they also undermined American national security. These operations actually were bad for us in the long run.
You say we are pretty good as a country. We've got a lot of experience doing it, actually overthrowing a government. It's what we do afterwards that we still don't quite have a handle on.
That's really one of the key points that emerges from the study of these episodes together. You always have this problem. Who are you going to put in after? Let me just cite one example that I talk about in my book, and that is in Cuba in 1898. We had promised to give Cuba its independence after it broke away from Spain. But we changed our mind in 1899, and we decided, no, we're gonna stay. We're gonna govern Cuba ourselves directly through military governors. We did that for a number of years, and then after that, we governed Cuba indirectly through a series of pliable dictators. And then flash forward up to 1959, so 60 years after the Spanish-American War, That's the year that Fidel Castro came to power. Now, in Fidel Castro's very first speech as leader of the victorious revolution, this is one of the documents I dug up while I was researching for this book, he makes a fascinating statement that looks back to history. In his speech, he said, "I promise you this time it's not going to be like 1898 again, when the Americans came in and took over our country." Now, I think if that speech had been reported in America, which it wasn't as far as I know, most Americans, first of all, would have had no idea what happened in 1898.
Right.
And secondly, they probably would have asked, what could something that happened 60 years ago possibly have to do with the politics of today? We don't realize, I think, that interventions like the ones we mount when we overthrow foreign governments leave a terrible legacy, and resentment over them burns and it motivates the passions of people over decades and generations, and ultimately it explodes.
Stephen Kinzer is the guest on This Week in America, best-selling author. Overthrow is now available in paperback, award-winning foreign correspondent, author of a number of bestsellers, including All the Shah's Men. So much to talk about. And you mentioned 1898. It's interesting, in 1898, we become a world power based on what was happening in Cuba. We're actually at that point talking about, should we annex Canada, and could we get away with invading Spain? We were feeling pretty cocky back then.
Actually, I think that's more or less been a theme of America. We really only got into the foreign expansion business after we filled up North America. So I suppose you could argue that Americans have been expanding ever since the Pilgrims landed. So it's been a steady process. And I think part of it at the beginning was motivated by a sense that the United States had developed some kind of an ideal system that we wanted to spread to other countries. I think the remnant of that view is still very strong today. We have a sense that the Lord has been so good to us that it would be selfish of us not to go out and share all of our blessings of freedom with other countries, perhaps especially with countries that are so backward they don't even realize how much they want to be like us. There's a certain view that America has found a system that is good for everybody, and we've developed this kind of zeal to go out and push it on people because we convince ourselves that we're actually doing them a favor. And I think this is a tendency in Americans that our leaders have often been able to take advantage of. It certainly worked in Iraq, but in my book I can see how this works in many other cases. When we intervene in foreign countries for either strategic or economic reasons, our leaders usually claim that they're not doing either one of those. They claim that they're intervening only to help the poor, oppressed victims of a savage regime in some faraway country. Not only are we not doing it to aggrandize ourselves or to get anything for ourselves, they argue, we're sacrificing ourselves in order to help those poor people. And this argument plays very well in America because Americans are very compassionate. We hate the idea that people are living under oppression, and we maintain this fantasy that we are able to change that simply by removing a tiny clique of thugs from the leadership of that country, thereby allowing the population to return to its natural state
and
of loving.
Based on that, we can't understand as a country why everybody hates us. If you read Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer, our guest on This Week in America, you will find out why. The underlying reason, basically, in all 14 of these cases we're talking about, where we've overthrown countries dating back to 1893, I guess you best exemplify by John Foster Dulles. Here's someone I knew a little bit about back in history, but tell us about him because he's fascinating, the motivation he had, and the fact that he's running the State Department and his brother Alan is head of the CIA, and the overt and the covert operations of the government are working hand in hand.
Yes, it's true. That was the only time in American history that ever happened. John Foster Dulles was truly a fascinating figure, and I think he may have been one of the people most responsible for shaping the world of the second half of the 20th century, including the war in Vietnam and other conflicts that broke out even after he was gone from the scene. Dulles was the most successful and most highly paid corporate lawyer in America, and he specialized in representing multinational corporations. His clients were digging canals in Brazil and mining in Peru and building banks in Saudi Arabia. So practically every giant multinational American corporation had John Foster Dulles as its counsel. Then Dulles became the Secretary of State at the age of 65, and after a lifetime of service to these multinational corporations. And he took with him into the State Department the view that the rights of American corporations were sacred and had to be respected by all foreign governments. When American corporations clashed with governments that were committed to social reform, he immediately saw that as an aggression against the U.S. and a sign of communist influence. The most vivid case of this came in Guatemala. In that country, the entire political economy was dominated by one giant American company, United Fruit. And United Fruit was formerly a client of Dulles when he was a private attorney. Once Dulles came into office, a reform-minded government in Guatemala decreed a land reform program to cut up large holdings and distribute parcels of land to poor Guatemalan families. This affected the interests of the United Fruit Company. United Fruit then appealed to Dulles and other people in Washington for help. They responded by overthrowing the democratic government in Guatemala. Ever since then, Guatemala has been in various forms of upheaval, including going through a civil war that produced hundreds of thousands of deaths. And it was an example of a country where we overthrew a leader who embraced fundamental American democratic values and replaced him with a tyrant who despised everything America stands for.
And here's something you talk about in the book is Dulles is saying when pinned, I'm not real sure why we're doing this in the sense that he's not a real threat now, but it's to our advantage in the United States to have somebody else there.
While I was researching for this book, and particularly the chapter on the Guatemala coup, I came across this wonderful document from some Latin American diplomat who had met Dulles just at the time when the Guatemala operation was being planned and the U.S. was intensifying its pressure on the reform government in Guatemala, which it was about to overthrow. So this diplomat, who was actually the Brazilian ambassador in Washington, asked Dulles, how can you be sure that this land reform program in Guatemala is actually a plot by the Kremlin, a plot of international communism aimed at the United States, rather than just a domestic issue? And Dulles had a fascinating answer. He said, it is true that we have no proof, but we are proceeding on the assumption that it must be so. So with that rationale, we went in and overthrew the government of Guatemala, and I think you can say that the same rationale came forward again before Iraq.
I was going to say you could jump forward.
Hard proof that Saddam was doing all these terrible things and building all these terrible weapons, but to use Dulles' phrase, we were proceeding on the assumption that it must be so. Here's another example of how themes in these interventions and these overthrows of foreign governments repeat themselves time and again, and that's what makes it so interesting to look at them all together and see them as part of this long continuum.
The book is Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer. It was a bestseller in hardcover. It will be a bestseller in paperback. I encourage you to read it. You're listening to This Week in America. Got about a minute and a half left in the program. It's interesting where we are now in Iraq. We're there. You go through all of the reasons in the book why it's difficult to say why we got there, but we're there. How do we get out without turning that entire region against us?
I think it's a very difficult. That's a very difficult challenge. I would say, first of all, our strategy for our withdrawal should be coordinated with the governments in the neighborhood. We have not worked nearly enough with them. Those countries have a much deeper interest in a stable Iraq even than we do, because they're always going to be living next to Iraq. So we need to drop our psychological problems in dealing with Iran and dealing with Syria, and we need to bring Turkey back to its position as a close American ally. That's one thing I'd like to see. But I do believe that there's not going to be a painless exit from Iraq. The strategy of withdrawal that I would now advocate is going to produce terrible upheavals. It'll produce ethnic cleansing in Iraq. It'll produce huge refugee surges. It will produce the execution of everybody that worked for the American occupation force. Why would I support a solution that will produce such terrible results? I think that might be the best we can hope for. And the longer we hold on, the more intense those repercussions are going to be. It brings up a final observation. Military intervention is always bad. It always brings bad results. There are some cases where it would be even worse not to intervene.
Stephen, unfortunately,
but even in those cases, you should always launch a military intervention with the understanding it's going to come out badly. They never come out well, and we're learning that again in Iraq. If there's one silver lining to this debacle, maybe it is that Americans will now be a little more reluctant to embrace these kinds of adventures and think more carefully before moving to overthrow foreign governments.
In the book Overthrow by Stephen Kinzer, 14 times we've deposed the leadership. 13 of those times it's turned out just like it's turned out this time. A fascinating book. Stephen, thank you for joining us on This Week in America.
That was fun. Thanks a lot.
Stephen.